At my father's burial, the only man who dared to look me in the eye was the gravedigger covered in dirt. He did not offer any hollow condolences. Instead, he gripped my arm and whispered, "Madam, the coffin beneath our feet is empty." Before the sun went down that day, I would learn that the people crying the hardest at the graveside were already dividing up his land, my reputation, and the ruins of my life. My name is Pearl Boyd. At 36 years old, I have built a life and a career out of calculating risk and anticipating disaster. As a contracts risk director at Northwake Civic Systems, my entire professional existence revolves around finding the fatal flaw in the paperwork. I hunt for the hidden liability, the lie buried deep under layers of dense legal jargon, the missing comma that could cost a company millions of dollars. I am paid handsomely to be sharp, self-controlled, and entirely impossible to fool. I see the angles everyone else misses. Yet, standing on the damp, salt-heavy grass of the Carolina coast, staring down at the polished mahogany box that supposedly held my father, I felt completely blind. Wesley Boyd had burned to death in a massive marina explosion. That was the official narrative provided by the local authorities. That was the tragic headline the news anchors had repeated on a continuous loop for the past 4 days. But the service, unfolding under a thick blanket of humid southern air, felt entirely wrong. My internal alarms, the ones that kept me alive in corporate boardrooms, were screaming. Everything was moving far too fast. A death like that, sudden and violent and tied to a man of my father's immense wealth, usually demands a rigorous investigation, a prolonged delay, a period of agonizing legal limbo. But here we were, less than 1 week later, standing over a sealed casket with the earth already turned. The pacing of the grief around me was manufactured, rushed along like a project running past its deadline. The mourners who stepped up to me offered no genuine warmth, only the same rehearsed phrases delivered like memorized lines in a community theater production. "Such tragic timing," a senior board member murmured, shaking my hand limply without ever actually meeting my eyes. "We are just doing what Wesley would have wanted," another business associate whispered, a ridiculous statement considering my father utterly despised pageantry and public displays of emotion. I kept my posture rigid, nodding politely while I watched my stepmother, Lenora Boyd. If I was numb with the shock of sudden loss, Lenora was vibrating with a strange, calculated energy. A grieving widow should be anchored to the casket, or at least mentally shattered by the violent absence of the man inside it. But Lenora's sharp eyes kept darting across the manicured lawn of the cemetery. She was conducting a silent, relentless head count. She was not mourning her husband, she was taking inventory of her assets. She tracked the arrival of Reese Tolland, the family lawyer whose tailored charcoal suit seemed entirely too sharp and triumphant for a funeral. Then her gaze shifted to Wallace Dane, the heavy-set, aggressive coastal developer who looked more like he was attending a lucrative ribbon-cutting ceremony than a solemn burial. I caught the exact moment they exchanged tight, imperceptible nods. The air around them felt incredibly thick, and it was not just the impending coastal storm rolling in from the Atlantic Ocean. As the brief, sterile service concluded and the polite crowd began to thin out, heading toward the long line of black town cars, I stayed behind. I needed one quiet moment to look at the grave, to try and force my rational brain to accept that my father was truly in the ground. The cemetery workers were already moving in with their heavy equipment, eager to finish before the heavy rain started. One of them, a man layered in dark soil and dried sweat, broke away from the crew and approached me. He was Amos Bell. I recognized his weathered face from the countless years my father had contributed to the financial upkeep of this historic cemetery. I expected him to offer a quiet apology or a respectful nod. Instead, he stopped right beside me, his large, rough hand gripping my forearm with a surprising, desperate force. "Madam, that coffin is empty," he whispered. His voice was a harsh, gravelly rasp against the rising wind. I yanked my arm back, staring at him in absolute shock. My immediate thought was that he was incredibly cruel, Or perhaps the years of grueling physical labor in the brutal southern heat had made him mentally unstable. How dare he say such a deranged thing to a daughter who was in the middle of burying her father? "What is wrong with you?" I demanded, my voice low but shaking with sudden fury. Amos did not flinch, nor did he back away. He leaned in closer, his dark eyes frantic but entirely lucid. "Listen to me, Pearl. Your father came to me 2 months ago. He paid me in cash. He told me that if anything ever looked wrong, if he died sudden and the math did not add up, I was to bury a weighted box. That is exactly what is in that hole right now. Rocks and lead." "Not Wesley." My breath caught sharply in my throat. The risk assessor in me frantically tried to calculate the probability of this gravedigger having a psychotic break versus the horrifying, impossible chance that he was telling the absolute truth. I looked back at the grave. The sealed casket, the aggressively rushed service, Lenora's wandering, calculating eyes, Reese Tollin's smug posture. The math was not adding up. Before I could ask a single demanding question, Amos reached into his pocket, pressed a cold, heavy object into my palm, and forced my fingers closed over it. I looked down and opened my hand. It was an old brass key, the metal worn incredibly smooth on the edges, with the number 17 stamped deeply into the center. "Do not go home," Amos told me, his tone dropping to a grim, terrifying warning. "Do not answer anyone. And whatever you do, do not trust the widow." He let go of my hand, picked up his shovel, and walked briskly back toward the open grave, leaving me standing completely alone with a heartbeat that felt like a heavy hammer striking against my ribs. A sharp, sudden buzz in my dark coat pocket broke my paralyzed trance. I pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the gloomy afternoon with a new text message from Lenora. "Come to the lake house alone immediately. There are estate papers that cannot wait." I stared at the glowing black text. My thumb hovered uncertainly over the glass screen. Lenora was a master of polished, elegant manipulation. If she wanted something from me, she would usually invite me over for a poured glass of incredibly expensive wine, offer layers of false sympathy, and gently guide me into a vulnerable corner before striking. This text message was entirely out of character for her. It was too blunt. It was far too cold. It was suspiciously urgent. Papers that cannot wait. Less than 1 hour after her husband supposedly went into the dirt. The dire warning from Amos echoed loudly in my mind. "Do not go home. Do not trust the widow." My quiet townhouse was a straight 20-minute drive down the main coastal highway. The sprawling family lake house was in the exact opposite direction. I looked down at the old brass key resting in my palm. 17. I knew exactly what that number meant. Just off Route 9, hidden behind a row of dying pine trees, there was a dilapidated, low-security storage facility. My father used to joke about it constantly, claiming he rented a space there just to keep his old, foul-smelling fishing gear out of the house, because Lenora absolutely hated the stench. A rising, suffocating sense of dread washed over my entire body. Cold and absolute, I finally saw the massive liability hidden in the paperwork of my own life. The funeral was a meticulously staged performance, and the final curtain had just fallen. Whatever was waiting for me at the lake house with Lenora, Reese, and Wallace was not a standard estate discussion. It was a snare, and the jaws were currently snapping shut. I turned my back on the empty grave. I bypassed the line of luxury cars waiting to ferry the fake mourners to the lavish reception. I did not type a single word back to Lenora. I unlocked my vehicle, started the engine, pulled aggressively onto the coastal highway, and drove straight toward Unit 17. The gravel access road off Route 9 was deeply rutted, rattling my teeth as I navigated my car toward the back of the sprawling lot. The storage facility was exactly as I remembered from my father's dismissive jokes, a forgotten, rust-stained stretch of identical orange doors, baking under the afternoon sun. I parked several yards away from Unit 17, the tires crunching loudly in the heavy silence of the deserted compound. The brass key felt warm and dangerously heavy in my tightly clenched fist. I slid the key into the heavy steel padlock, securing the corrugated roll-up door. It turned with a harsh metallic click. I gripped the handle, braced myself for the foul smell of stagnant salt water and rotting fishing nets, and shoved the heavy metal door upward. Instead of darkness and discarded maritime junk, I was hit by the harsh, artificial glare of high-intensity LED shop lights. I froze in the threshold. The space inside was not a storage locker. It was a stripped-down, aggressively functional war room. 3 heavy plastic folding tables were pushed together in the center. Groaning under the weight of 4 oversized computer monitors, a high-capacity laser printer, and a tangled web of thick black cables. A narrow canvas cot sat pushed against the far wall, flanked by at least 24 pristine white legal banker boxes stacked haphazardly toward the aluminum ceiling. The air conditioning unit in the corner hummed violently, fighting the southern heat. "Pull the door down and lock it from the inside," a sharp, uncompromising voice commanded from the left corner of the unit. I stepped inside, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy flashlight I kept in my purse, but I forced my fingers to unclench. I turned around, dragged the metal door down until it slammed against the concrete, and slid the interior deadbolt into place. When I turned back, a woman was standing near the glowing monitors. She appeared to be in her late 60s, dressed in dark, unwrinkled slacks and a practical gray cardigan. She possessed the kind of invisible, utterly unremarkable appearance that allowed a person to blend into any bureaucratic background, but her eyes were cold, assessing, and razor-sharp. "I am Mara Quill," she stated, not bothering to offer a handshake. "Your father trusted me because my entire career was built on hunting people who think they are smarter than the paper trail they leave behind. I spent 30 years as a federal postal inspector. I track forged documents, phantom wire transfers, and vanished money." My mind struggled to process the sudden influx of absurd variables. "My father is dead," I said, my voice sounding hollow and entirely unconvincing even to my own ears. "I just left his funeral." "You left a theater production." A low, incredibly tired voice rasped from the shadows behind the towering wall of legal boxes. The breath physically left my lungs. The ground beneath my leather shoes seemed to tilt dangerously. Stepping out from behind the cardboard fortress was a man wearing faded denim jeans, a cheap gray hooded sweatshirt, and an exhausted expression that aged him by at least 10 years. He smelled faintly of stale coffee and ozone, not the expensive cedar cologne I had associated with him my entire life. It was Wesley Boyd, my father, alive. He looked incredibly fragile, stripped of the terrifying corporate aura he usually wore like armor, yet he was standing right in front of me, breathing in the heavily air-conditioned air. "Dad," I whispered, the single syllable tearing its way out of my tight throat. I did not run to hug him. I am a contracts risk director. My brain is wired to identify the threat before seeking comfort. The fact that he was alive meant the threat level had just escalated into the stratosphere. "What did you do?" Wesley collapsed heavily onto a metal folding chair, burying his face in his rough hands for a brief second before looking up at me. "I staged my own exit. Pearl, I had to disappear. If I had stayed in that house, if I had gone to the marina and gotten on my boat on Tuesday morning like I was supposed to, I would not be sitting here right now. Within 48 hours, they were going to have me declared legally incompetent, federally indicted as a criminal, or entirely dead. I simply chose the version of the story that kept my heart beating and gave me a massive head start." I walked forward, placing my hands flat on the edge of the folding table to steady my trembling legs. "Who is they?" "Lenora," he said, the name dropping from his mouth like poison. "Your stepmother, Wallace Dane, Reese Tolland, and Grant, my half-brother. Weak, chronically indebted, eager to please, and constantly terrified of his own shadow." The betrayal stung, a sharp prick against the larger, gaping wound of the conspiracy. "Why?" I demanded, keeping my tone perfectly level despite the chaos erupting in my chest. "You have enough money to buy out God." What could they possibly want that requires a fake explosion and a coffin filled with lead weights? Mara stepped forward, tapping a manicured fingernail against a glowing monitor displaying satellite imagery of the Carolina coastline. They are moving to seize absolute control of the Boyd estate, specifically a massive, undeveloped coastal parcel right here. The land alone, combined with the development rights Wallace Dane needs to push his new shipping project through the local government, is worth tens of millions of dollars. But your father was refusing to sign the final transfer. So, they decided to remove him from the equation. And where do I fit into this? I asked, my eyes snapping back to my father. Lenora texted me immediately after the burial. She told me to come to the lake house alone for urgent estate papers. Mara let out a harsh, humorless laugh. If you had gone to the lake house, Pearl, you would be sitting in the back of a police cruiser by midnight. If you had gone to your own townhouse, it would have been even worse. My blood ran completely cold. What are you talking about? Wesley stood up, leaning over the table to pull a thick file folder toward me. He flipped it open. They set a trap for you, sweetheart. While we were preparing the fake funeral, they were busy planting digital records and forged financial documents on your personal servers and hidden inside your home office. They manipulated your signature blocks from the contracts you approved at Northwake Civic Systems. They are framing me, I realized aloud, the horrific geometry of their plans suddenly locking into place. I stared at the dense pages of banking codes and copied signatures. They are building a paper trail to make it look like I am the architect of a massive financial fraud scheme. They want to make me look like the greedy, estranged daughter who stole from her father, effectively disinheriting me while ensuring I spend the next 20 years in a federal prison. Exactly, Mara confirmed, crossing her arms over her cardigan. Once you are indicted and publicly disgraced, Lenora steps in as the grieving, betrayed widow, takes full control of the estate to protect it, and hands the coastal parcel over to Wallace Dane through Reese Tollin's legal loopholes. But they rushed, Wesley said, his eyes finally showing a spark of the ruthless businessman I recognized. He pointed to a timeline sketched out on a massive dry erase board propped against the far wall. Look at the dates. Pearl, look at the probate filings Reese submitted. Look at the insurance movement and the emergency board actions Lenora authorized. They were so eager to seize control that they prepared and backdated the paperwork for my death 4 days before the boat actually exploded. I followed his trembling finger along the timeline. The dates were glaring, undeniable proof of premeditation. The trap had been set long before the fire. The fake funeral, I breathed out, the realization dawning on me. It was not just a cover for your escape. It was bait. I needed them to think they won, Wesley admitted, his voice dropping low. I needed them to feel secure enough to move the assets. Because when people like Wallace and Lenora think they are untouchable, they move too fast. They get incredibly sloppy. They leave a trail Mara can track. We forced them to accelerate their timeline and expose their network. Silence stretched across the humming, artificially lit unit. The air felt incredibly thin. I looked at the stolen documents, the glowing monitors, the retired federal investigator, and finally at the man who had raised me, lied to me, and manipulated his own violent end just to win a corporate blood feud against his own wife. I felt the sudden, hot surge of absolute fury replace the cold dread in my veins. I was not just a pawn on their board. I was the designated sacrifice. I walked around the folding table until I was standing inches away from my father. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same dead, calculating tone I used when I terminated a multi-million-dollar vendor contract. I will help you, I told him, holding his exhausted gaze. I will tear their entire empire apart piece by piece. But hear me clearly right now. You tell me the absolute truth, every single detail, no matter how ugly it gets. Because if I find out you are lying to me too, if I discover you are holding back one single piece of leverage to protect yourself, I will not save you. I will strike the match myself, and I will burn you down with the rest of them. Wesley looked at me. a profound mixture of devastating sorrow and terrifying pride settling onto his weathered face. He nodded slowly. "Understood," he whispered. My father reached across the plastic folding table and unrolled a large, heavily annotated topographical map of the Carolina coastline. He weighed the curling corners down with a heavy stapler and a cold mug of coffee. The harsh overhead lighting cast sharp shadows over the blue ink and red marker circles dominating the paper. He pointed a scarred finger at a small, irregular green polygon situated right at the edge of the deep water inlet. "The central asset is not just the liquid family money, Pearl," my father explained, his voice steadying into the familiar, commanding cadence he used during board meetings. "It is this specific piece of earth. The old Boyd Cemetery parcel. For years, it was just a historical tax burden, but the geography has shifted. Wallace Dane is trying to push through a massive, federally subsidized port corridor. He desperately needs deep water access for the new shipping lanes, but the surrounding miles are entirely locked up by protected wetlands." He tapped the green polygon hard enough to make the table shake. "This cemetery parcel is the only legal, viable bottleneck. Without it, his entire port project collapses. With it, Wallace secures hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure grants. I refused to sell it, so they found a way to take it." Mara stepped up beside him, sliding a thick sheaf of stapled legal documents across the table toward me. "This is a forged trust amendment," she stated flatly. "Reese Tolland drafted it. It completely rewrites the succession of the estate. It bypasses the standard probate holding periods and transfers absolute executor control directly to Lenora as the surviving spouse. The moment the judge stamps this paper, Lenora has the legal authority to immediately transfer the cemetery land into Wallace Dane's commercial redevelopment company, before anyone can even file a grievance to challenge it." I stared at the paperwork. The legal mechanics were elegant, vicious, and incredibly fast, but the glaring question still remained. Why go through the immense trouble of framing me if Lenora has the trust amendment? She wins. Why do they need to put me in a federal prison? "Because you are the only person who has the financial resources and the corporate expertise to contest the land transfer," my father replied softly. "You are a contracts risk director. You know exactly where to look for the structural flaws in their paperwork. They could not just steal the land. They had to completely neutralize you as a threat. And they decided to use your own brilliant career as the weapon against you." Mara opened a second folder. This one was entirely filled with vendor payment logs, compliance certifications, and master service agreements. "Look at the approval signatures. Pearl." I picked up the top document. It was a vendor contract authorizing a massive payout from the Boyd family holding company to an entity called Apex Storm Recovery Solutions. The hair on my arms stood up. At the bottom of the final page, executed in flawless blue ink, was my exact signature, complete with my specific digital timestamp and my corporate title from Northwake Civic Systems. "I never signed this," I whispered, a cold wave of genuine panic washing over my chest. "I have never even heard of this company." "Reese Tolland is a very thorough lawyer," Mara said, her tone completely devoid of sympathy. "He used your old signature blocks and the hidden metadata from your past communications to build a massive, irrefutable paper trail. During your first few years at Northwake, your role gave you legitimate, routine access to highly specific vendor compliance language. Reese lifted entire paragraphs of your proprietary legal phrasing and copied it directly into these fake contracts." I flipped through the pages frantically. The terminology was mine. The specific indemnity clauses, the arbitration requirements, the risk allocation paragraphs, it was exactly how I wrote contracts. To an outside auditor, this looked entirely authentic. It looked like I had personally vetted and approved a network of fraudulent storm recovery vendors, funneling family wealth into shell entities. "Wallace Dane has his public relations people standing by right now," my father added, his expression grim. "They are prepared to leak this entire fabricated dossier to the regional press by tomorrow morning. The headline is already written: The grieving daughter systematically stole from her dying father before his tragic death. They are going to spin a narrative that you drained the family accounts to fund a lavish lifestyle, turning public sympathy for you into absolute disgust overnight. You will be completely toxic. No lawyer will take your case, and no judge will grant you leniency. My mind raced, desperately calculating a countermeasure. We need to file an emergency injunction, I stated, my voice gaining strength. We go to a federal magistrate tonight. We freeze the entire estate, lock down the trust accounts, and force a forensic audit of Reese Tollin's law firm. We cannot do that, Mara interrupted smoothly. I spent the last 3 days tracking the electronic routing numbers and the timestamp data on the preliminary probate filings. Wallace Dane already owns the referees. I can confirm that at least one senior county clerk and one high-level private banker are completely compromised. They are the ones who pushed the forged trust amendment through the automated system without triggering the standard fraud alerts. The reality of our situation crashed down on me with suffocating weight. So ordinary legal channels are useless. They are far too slow, Mara agreed. If you walk into a courthouse on Monday morning to file a grievance, the compromised clerk will immediately tip off Wallace. By Tuesday afternoon, Wallace will have poured concrete over the cemetery parcel, laundered the payout money through offshore accounts, and the physical evidence of the forgery will vanish into thin air. You will be fighting a ghost, and you will be doing it from a jail cell. I needed to know exactly how far the trap had already sprung. I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket. I bypassed my usual contacts and dialed the landline number of Eleanor Higgins, the elderly woman who lived in the townhouse directly across the street from mine. She answered on the 4th ring. "Eleanor, it is Pearl," I said, keeping my voice light and steady. "I am so sorry to bother you on a weekend, but I'm still at the funeral reception and I think I left my oven on. Could you do me a massive favor and just look out your front window to see if you can spot any smoke coming from my kitchen vent? Oh, sweetheart, I am so sorry about your father," Eleanor murmured. There was a brief pause as I heard the sound of her heavy curtains shifting. Then, her voice dropped to an anxious whisper. "Pearl, there is no smoke, but there are 2 dark, unmarked vehicles parked directly blocking your driveway, and there are 2 police officers standing on your front porch. They have been knocking on your door for the last 10 minutes. Should I go over and ask them what they want?" "No," I ordered sharply. "Do not go outside. Eleanor, do not speak to them. Just lock your doors." "Thank you." I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the folding table. The silence in Unit 17 felt incredibly heavy. The theoretical threat was now a physical reality standing on my front porch. If I had driven home from the cemetery like a normal, grieving daughter, those officers would have handed me a warrant, seized my personal computers, and discovered the planted financial records Reese Tolland had hidden on my hard drives. The funeral was never the end of anything. It was merely the opening move in a meticulously planned public execution of my reputation and my freedom. I looked at the glowing computer monitors. I looked at the forged contracts bearing my stolen signature. And finally, I looked at my father, who was watching me with a mixture of hope and intense fear. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the refined corporate director to panic and hide, but hiding would only make me look incredibly guilty. If I ran, the narrative Wallace created would become the permanent truth. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, sterile air fill my lungs. The fear evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline clarity. I make my living destroying bad contracts, and Lenora Boyd had just drafted the worst one I had ever seen. "We do not hide," I told them, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "If we stay in this storage locker, the estate machine locks into place and we lose everything. We need to strike back immediately, before they even realize the trap is empty." The heavy mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit above us seemed to grow louder, filling the suffocating silence that followed my declaration. My father did not look relieved by my willingness to fight. He did not offer a grateful smile. Instead, The adrenaline that had kept him upright seemed to instantly drain away, leaving behind a man who looked thoroughly broken. He reached up, rubbed his exhausted eyes with trembling fingers, and looked like a man preparing to confess to a violent crime. He leaned heavily across the plastic folding table, reached into the nearest white banker box, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. He pushed it slowly across the table until it rested directly in front of my hands. "I need you to understand exactly what you are fighting for. Pearl," my father said, his voice stripped of all its usual defensive pride. "You are looking at those forged trust amendments and those fake contracts, and you think you are simply fighting for your rightful inheritance. You think you are protecting the Boyd family fortune from a hostile takeover. But the terrible truth is, that fortune is nowhere near as clean as you have always believed." I stared down at the dark leather cover of the ledger. My professional instincts, the ones that usually guided me through dense corporate compliance audits, flared with a new, sickening kind of dread. "What does that mean? The Boyd Holding Company has been audited every single year. The revenue streams are public. The legitimate ones are public," my father corrected, staring at a blank spot on the corrugated metal wall. "Years ago, after those massive coastal storms ripped through the southern counties, the entire region was physically drowning. Do you remember the news coverage? The state government was virtually bankrupt. Federal disaster money was moving far too slowly. Thousands of people were sleeping on the floors of high school gymnasiums. Wallace Dane came to my office with a desperate proposal. He had the massive construction crews, the heavy equipment, and the supply chains, but he lacked the immediate liquid capital to deploy them across state lines. He asked to use my corporate network to move temporary money between emergency housing vendors just to keep the recovery efforts moving. He let out a harsh, bitter sigh that echoed in the small room. I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself I was saving thousands of jobs. I justified it by saying I was keeping local crews working and putting roofs over desperate, terrified families during an unprecedented disaster. It was supposed to be a short-term bridge loan. But those financial shortcuts became a highly efficient, long-term fraud engine. And I simply stood by and let it happen. Mara remained completely silent in the background, her arms crossed tight against her gray cardigan, allowing my father to bear the absolute full weight of his own confession. "Wallace learned a very dark, very profitable lesson that year," my father continued, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He learned that disaster relief money moves fastest when elected officials are under extreme public pressure. Nobody meticulously audits a rescue budget when grieving citizens are crying on national television." So, Reese Tolland went to work behind the scenes. He built dozens of regional shell companies. He gave them names that sounded incredibly patriotic: local and compassionate, Coastal Heritage Relief, Southern Shelter Initiatives, Carolina Rebuilding Trust. They sounded like noble charities, but they were all just empty bank accounts entirely controlled by Wallace Dane. My stomach turned violently as the structural mechanics of their conspiracy fell into place. And Lenora, you are telling me she knew about this the entire time. Lenora did not merely marry into my wealth. Pearl. She became the brilliant social architect of the entire scheme, my father stated, his voice hardening with genuine disgust. She hosted the lavish charity galas at the lake house. She curated the guest lists. She invited the right local politicians, the wealthy out-of-state donors, the county zoning board members. She served them incredibly expensive champagne, cried beautifully over the storm victims, and smoothly steered their public recovery funds directly toward Wallace's fraudulent shell companies. She made aggressive financial theft look like high society philanthropy. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "What about Grant?" I asked, dreading the answer about my half-brother. Grant was notoriously weak, but I had always assumed he was just a harmless, privileged fool. "Grant has always been weak," my father stated bluntly, offering no paternal defense. "He had massive gambling debts and an extravagant lifestyle he simply could not afford to maintain. Wallace found out and quietly bought his debt. In exchange, Grant became their primary runner. He moved the physical envelopes of cash to avoid wire transfer flags. He signed the courier receipts for the forged vendor contracts under the guise of delivering architectural blueprints. He carried illicit instructions between Reese and Wallace, actively pretending he did not understand what he was doing as so he could keep his expensive sports cars and his exclusive country club memberships. I could not listen to any more abstract explanations. I reached out and flipped the leather ledger open. Inside were hundreds of printed invoices, glossy photographs, and heavily redacted internal memos. As I rapidly scanned the pages, the abstract concept of white-collar financial fraud suddenly crystallized into horrific, undeniable human suffering. I saw invoices tied directly to deeply impoverished coastal counties. I read field inspection reports detailing how desperate families were left living in fundamentally unsafe, mold-infested temporary housing trailers for over 18 months. I saw copies of handwritten, heartbreaking letters from displaced residents begging the management companies for basic plumbing repairs. And right next to those desperate letters, I saw the expedited reimbursement checks. Wallace, Lenora, and Reese were systematically collecting premium government payouts for luxury construction materials while intentionally sticking vulnerable storm survivors in toxic tin cans. They were charging the state for reinforced steel and delivering cheap, rotting plywood. Suddenly, the narrative in my head violently shifted. The anger I felt about being framed felt incredibly small and selfish. This was no longer just a legal battle about a stolen inheritance. This was no longer a story about a resentful stepmother trying to push me out of the family picture. It was about millions of dollars in stolen recovery funds. It was about fraudulent grief. It was about a private, untouchable empire built entirely on the shattered lives of other people's disasters. "I have spent 7 years sitting in this room," my father whispered, gesturing wildly to the towering stacks of white banker boxes surrounding us. "For 7 years, I lied to everyone. I came to this storage unit in the middle of the night. I painstakingly copied corporate records, private call logs, offshore payment chains, and handwritten notes from Lenora's desk. I tracked every single dollar they stole from those devastated communities. I was waiting for the exact moment I had enough irrefutable, undeniable evidence to survive exposing them without getting a bullet in the back of my head." He looked up at me, his eyes desperately pleading for a sliver of understanding, a tiny ounce of daughterly forgiveness. "I built this archive, Pearl. I am trying to make it right. I am trying to stop them." I closed the ledger. The loud smack of the heavy leather cover echoed sharply against the aluminum ceiling. I looked at the man who had raised me. I saw his overwhelming guilt, his profound exhaustion, and his desperate desire for absolution. But the risk director inside me, the woman who had spent her entire adult life cleaning up other people's toxic liabilities, felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. "You do not get to be the hero of this story," I told him, my voice entirely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. He flinched physically, as if I had struck him across the face, but he did not look away. "I will help you," I continued, leaning over the folding table so he could see the absolute, terrifying conviction in my eyes. "I will help you tear Wallace Dane and Lenora to pieces. I will help you put Reese Tolland in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. But I am doing this on one strict condition, and if you hesitate to agree for even 1 second, I will walk right out of that metal door and leave you to face them completely alone." "Name it," he said quickly, his voice cracking. "We do not protect the Boyd name," I stated, my tone sharp and final. "We do not hide your early involvement. We do not hire lawyers to spin a sympathetic public relations narrative about how you were tragically duped or how you heroically gathered evidence in secret. When the hammer finally falls, we destroy the whole system. We burn the entire corrupt corporate structure to the ground, and we let your legacy burn right along with it." My father stared at me. The heavy silence stretched out for one long, agonizing minute. He looked at the ledger, then at the boxes of evidence he had spent 7 years compiling, and finally back at me. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded his head. "Burn it all," he agreed. The drive from the storage facility to the lake house took exactly 45 minutes. I used every single second of that time to bury the razor-sharp rage I had uncovered in Unit 17. When I finally pulled my car onto the crushed white gravel of the Boyd Estate driveway, I was no longer the brilliant contracts risk director ready to burn down a corrupt empire. I was exactly what my enemies needed me to be: a deeply traumatized, profoundly exhausted orphan who was entirely too fragile to put up a fight. They had clearly expected me to vanish into the coastal fog, to run straight home into the waiting arms of the local police, or to simply collapse under the weight of my father's violent death. Walking through the massive mahogany front doors of the lake house was a deliberate, calculated act of psychological warfare. I was walking straight back into the den. The post-burial memorial dinner was already in full swing. The sprawling, high-ceilinged living room was filled with the low, polished hum of polite mourning. Waiters in crisp black vests circulated with trays of expensive champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Lenora had spared absolutely no expense to make her new widowhood look like a tragic societal event. I kept my posture slightly slumped, my shoulders drawn inward. I made my face pale and blank. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and stood near the edge of the grand stone fireplace, projecting an aura of complete, stunned compliance. Lenora spotted me almost immediately. I watched the brief, sharp flash of genuine surprise cross her perfectly contoured face before she buried it under a suffocating mask of maternal sorrow. She glided across the polished hardwood floor, her expensive black silk dress whispering against her legs. "Oh, Pearl, my sweet girl," Lenora cooed, wrapping her cold, thin arms around my shoulders in a highly visible embrace. She smelled of heavy floral perfume and predatory calculation. "I was so incredibly worried about you. When you did not reply to my text message, I feared the absolute worst. This day has been far too much for you to bear." "I just needed to drive," I whispered, forcing my voice to sound hollow and entirely defeated. "I just needed a few minutes alone with my thoughts." "Of course you did," she soothed, pulling back to gently brush a stray lock of hair away from my face. Her eyes, however, were entirely devoid of warmth. They were actively scanning my face for any sign of suspicion. "But we must be strong now. We have to secure your father's legacy. In fact, Reese and I were just discussing the urgent necessity of an emergency probate hearing on Monday morning. It is purely administrative, of course. Just a temporary administration to ensure the estate accounts do not freeze while the banks process the terrible news. We cannot have the family charity suffering, can we? Temporary administration. The legal mechanism she needed to bypass standard holding periods and instantly seize control of the trust. "Whatever you think is best, Lenora," I murmured, staring blankly at the floor. "I cannot even begin to think about paperwork right now." Wallace Dane materialized beside us, holding a heavy crystal glass filled with dark amber liquor. His massive, imposing frame seemed to absorb the light in the room. He offered me a grim, rehearsed smile. "Your father was a visionary, Pearl," Wallace stated, his booming voice dialed down to a faux respectful register. "We had massive plans for the coastal redevelopment, real legacy planning. It is an absolute tragedy. He will not be here to see the Newport corridor break ground, but we will make sure his vision for that cemetery parcel is honored. I consider it a personal duty to manage that land exactly how he would have wanted." He was talking about the property as if the deed was already sitting securely in his breast pocket. I simply nodded, playing the role of the oblivious, grieving daughter perfectly. "Speaking of paperwork, Pearl," Reese Tolland interjected smoothly, appearing from the crowd like a sleek, dangerous shark drawn to blood in the water. The family lawyer adjusted his impeccably tailored suit jacket. "While we prepare the preliminary filings for the judge, I might need you to clarify a few historical signatures for me, just standard compliance checks. You handled quite a bit of vendor authorization language for the family entities a few years ago. Did you not? Your corporate expertise was always so helpful to Wesley." It was a brilliantly disguised trap. He was trying to bait me into verbally acknowledging the forged documents in front of a room full of high society witnesses. He wanted to establish the very first public hint of my guilt. I blinked slowly, looking at Reese with wide, confused eyes. Vendor language, Reese. I honestly have no idea what you are talking about. I work for Northwake. I never mixed my corporate job with my father's private charities. If my name is on something, it must be a clerical error from his old accounting team. You will have to look into that yourself. Reese's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His trap neatly sidestepped by a seemingly traumatized woman who simply could not remember the details. Before Reese could push the issue further, Grant stumbled into our small circle. My half-brother looked like a complete wreck. His tie was loosened, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning. He was holding a sleek black tablet tightly against his chest, clutching it like a physical shield. "Are we talking about the estate already?" Grant slurred slightly, entirely missing the subtle tension in the group. "Because I was trying to find the old insurance policies for the boat, and I cannot find anything in his home office. Do you think he kept copies somewhere else? Like in some old storage junk or a lockbox?" The silence that followed his words was incredibly loud. Lenora shot Grant a look of such absolute, terrifying venom that he physically took a step backward. Reese quickly cleared his throat, attempting to cover the massive blunder. Storage junk. Grant had just accidentally confirmed everything I needed to know. They had already searched the house, and they were panicking because they could not find my father's private ledgers. Unit 17 was already haunting them. "Grant, please," Lenora hissed under her breath. "This is hardly the time or the place. Go get some fresh air." Grant flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. He turned and practically fled toward the sprawling outdoor patio, leaving his black tablet resting precariously on the edge of the nearest appetizer table. I knew I only had a window of a few minutes. I excused myself from the Viper Pit, claiming I desperately needed a glass of water and a moment of quiet. I navigated through the crowd, charting a path that took me directly past the table where Grant had abandoned his device. I reached into my purse and pulled out what appeared to be a standard, harmless white charging cable. Mara had given it to me right before I left the storage locker. It was actually a highly sophisticated, military-grade data extractor designed to mirror hard drives and bypass standard commercial encryption in a matter of seconds. I leaned against the table, shielding my hands with my body. I picked up the tablet, seamlessly plugged the extractor cable into the port, and connected the other end directly into my phone. A green light pulsed once, silently confirming the data transfer had initiated. While the progress bar crawled across my hidden screen, I looked up and saw Delia Voss. She was Lenora's personal assistant, a young woman who looked chronically sleep-deprived and entirely miserable. She was struggling to carry a massive stack of heavy floral arrangements toward the back hallway, her arms shaking under the weight. No one in the room was offering to help her. To the wealthy guests, she was simply part of the furniture. I slipped the tablet back onto the table, the transfer complete, and walked over to Delia. I reached out and took half of the heavy vases from her trembling arms. "Let me help you with those," I said softly. Delia jumped, her eyes widening in sheer panic. "Oh, Miss Boyd. No, you do not have to do that. Mrs. Boyd will be furious if she sees you carrying things today. Lenora is busy entertaining the county commissioners," I replied, offering her a genuine, sympathetic smile. "And you look like you have been running on empty for 3 days straight. Come on, let us get these to the kitchen." As we walked down the quiet hallway together, I made sure to treat her like an actual human being. I asked if she had eaten anything today. I told her how much my father always appreciated her hard work behind the scenes. By the time we set the flowers down on the marble kitchen counter, the defensive, terrified posture she always maintained around Lenora had completely softened. She looked at me with profound, unexpected gratitude. That small act of basic decency was an investment I fully intended to collect on later. 10 minutes later, I locked myself inside one of the lavish guest bathrooms on the second floor. I pulled out my phone and opened the copied files from Grant's tablet. I bypassed the embarrassing personal emails and the endless gambling debts, diving straight into his synchronized calendar. I found exactly what I was looking for. There was a newly created, highly restricted calendar entry scheduled for 8 o'clock on Monday morning, entirely off the official books. It was marked for a closed-door signing session at the County Maritime Hall. The attendees were Wallace Dane, Lenora Boyd, Reese Tolland, and the presiding chairman of the County Zoning Board. They were not waiting for the afternoon probate hearing. They were going to push the illegal land transfer through a corrupt official first thing in the morning, hours before the forged trust amendment was even meant to go public on the legal docket. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart pounding with a cold, triumphant rhythm. I finally understood their true vulnerability. They were not acting out of strength. They were rushing blindly because they were terrified. They were absolutely convinced that my father had left behind something far stronger than a second will, and they were desperately trying to steal the earth before his ghost could rise up and stop them. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, checked my pale, grieving reflection in the mirror one last time, and prepared to walk back downstairs. I was no longer the prey. I was the architect of their destruction, and I had exactly 36 hours to build the perfect gallows. I slipped my phone back into my pocket, unlocked the guest bathroom door, and stepped back out into the polished, suffocating atmosphere of the lake house. I had exactly what I needed from the digital calendar. But before I could leave the estate, I needed to close the terrifying loose end Grant had just unraveled in the living room. I bypassed the crowded main hall, slipping through the heavy glass doors that led out to the sprawling, multi-tiered stone patio. The humid coastal air was thick with the sharp smell of approaching rain and dark water. I found my half-brother exactly where I expected him to be. Grant was standing near the edge of the darkened boathouse, aggressively pulling at a silver hip flask, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic panic. I stepped quietly out of the shadows. The sudden sound of my leather heels striking the wooden dock made him jump violently. "Storage junk, Grant?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. He choked on the dark liquor, coughing and stumbling backward against the wooden railing. He looked at me with wild, terrified eyes. "Pearl, I did not mean it like that. I just had too much to drink. You know how my head gets when I'm stressed?" I closed the distance between us in 3 rapid steps. I shoved my hand hard against his chest, pinning him against the damp wood. "I know about the temporary disaster vendors. Grant, I know about the offshore accounts. I know you signed the forged courier receipts for Wallace Dane." All the blood instantly drained from his face. The weak, privileged facade he wore entirely collapsed, leaving behind nothing but a profoundly frightened child in a very expensive suit. He dropped the silver flask. It clattered loudly against the deck. "Wallace owns my debts," Grant sobbed, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate, rushing flood. "I owed over $2 million to private sports syndicates. They were going to kill me. Pearl, Wallace bought the paper. He told me I either worked off the debt or he would let them break my legs. I had no choice." "You always have a choice," I snapped, disgusted by his cowardice. "What else did you do for them?" Grant squeezed his eyes shut, tears leaking down his flushed cheeks. "They made me manage his health records. I lied to the concierge doctor. I told the physician Wesley was forgetting things, getting confused, wandering around the house at night. I signed the false medical delivery manifests for the boat. I just kept my head down and did exactly what Lenora told me to do. Please, Pearl, you have to believe I never wanted him dead." I released his lapels, stepping back as if his physical proximity might infect me with his weakness. "Stay out of my way," I commanded. I left him weeping softly against the railing and walked briskly back toward the main house. I needed to leave immediately. I walked through the catering wing to avoid Lenora's watchful eyes. As I reached the heavy service doors leading to the gravel driveway, a hand reached out from the shadows and grabbed my wrist. It was Delia Voss. Lenora's chronically exhausted assistant looked utterly terrified, but her jaw was set with a rigid, unfamiliar determination. She shoved a thick, scorch-marked manila envelope directly into my hands. "She ordered me to burn the contents of the private safe in the master study yesterday," Delia whispered, her eyes darting nervously down the empty hallway. "I burned the covers so she would smell the smoke in the fireplace. But I kept the insides. You treated me like a human being tonight. Pearl, no one in this house ever looks at me. Take it. Please just take it and go." I gripped the heavy envelope, nodded my silent, profound gratitude, and walked out into the dark night. I drove exactly 4 miles down the coastal highway before pulling my car onto a deserted, unlit scenic overlook facing the crashing ocean. I threw the vehicle into park, locked the doors, and turned on the bright, overhead dome light. My hands were shaking slightly as I unwound the string on the manila envelope. The bitter, acrid smell of burnt paper filled the tight cabin of my car. I pulled out the thick stack of documents. Sitting right on top was a collection of handwritten letters. I recognized the sweeping, elegant cursive immediately. It was the handwriting of my late mother, Nora Boyd. I had not seen that handwriting since she passed away 20 years ago. The edges of the pale blue stationery were blackened with soot. The letters were addressed to my father. As I read the words my mother wrote in the final months of her life, the breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. Nora had warned him. She had explicitly warned my father that Lenora, who was aggressively circling their social sphere at the time, was a deeply manipulative predator. "She isolates the people she wants to control. Wesley," my mother had written in a frantic, underlining stroke. "I see how she looks at Pearl. Whenever our daughter becomes inconvenient to Lenora's grand social designs, she will build a wall between you two. She will make you think Pearl does not need you, and she will make Pearl believe you do not care." My mother had mapped out the exact psychological blueprint of my ruined childhood before she even died. I pushed the letters aside and found a stack of copied emails with attached server routing data. I stared at the screen names. They were messages I had sent my father during my early 20s. Desperate, angry emails asking why he had skipped my college graduation, why he never called on my birthday, why he only communicated through his executive assistants. I looked at the harsh, dismissive replies I had received from his account, the ones that had ultimately caused me to stop trying entirely. Then, I looked at the raw metadata Delia had highlighted. The replies did not originate from my father's corporate server. They were routed through a private, encrypted network registered entirely to Lenora. For 15 years, I had blamed my father's corporate obsession for the massive, freezing distance between us. I thought I was simply not good enough to hold his attention, but it was all a meticulously engineered illusion. Lenora had intercepted my messages, forged his cruel replies, and permanently deleted my original pleas. She had systematically starved our relationship to death, so she could be the absolute only voice in his ear. She engineered the massive fights, the crushing silences, and the profound estrangement. A fresh, agonizing wave of devastation hit me. I sifted blindly through the rest of the burned papers. I found a thick legal folder containing a forged incapacity packet. It was dated exactly 24 hours before the Marina explosion. It included a sworn statement from the compromised concierge doctor, corroborating Grant's lies about my father's supposed severe dementia. Lenora had pre-drafted an emergency conservatorship request. If the bomb had not killed him, they were going to legally strip him of his mind, lock him inside a luxurious psychiatric facility, and take the estate anyway. At the very bottom of the envelope, I found the banking ledgers for Nora Boyd's Memorial Foundation. It was a charity my father established to honor my mother's life, dedicated to funding pediatric care in the coastal counties. I traced the highlighted routing numbers across the page. The funds had been quietly bled dry over the past 5 years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for sick children had been aggressively funneled into Wallace Dane's fraudulent redevelopment shells to cover his short-term liquidity problems. They had not just stolen from the living. They had completely desecrated the legacy of my dead mother to finance their toxic corporate empire. I dropped the papers onto the passenger seat. The crushing weight of the money, the land deals, and the fraudulent contracts suddenly felt entirely secondary. The revelation that shattered me was far more intimate. They did not just try to steal physical property. They stole years. They stole the Sunday dinners we never had. They stole the quiet moments of advice I never asked for because I thought he would dismiss me. They stole the basic, fundamental safety of a family, replacing it with a cold, terrifying isolation. Time is the single most finite, precious asset in the human experience, and Lenora had stolen 2 decades of it from me. I sat in the cold car and allowed myself exactly 3 minutes to violently weep for the ghost of the father I thought I had lost, and for the man who was currently sitting in a storage unit, entirely unaware that he had been a prisoner in his own home. When the 3 minutes were up, the tears stopped. The profound, suffocating grief inside my chest hardened into something entirely different. It crystallized into a sharp, blinding, absolute ice. The panic was completely gone. The fear of being framed evaporated. I looked at my reflection in the dark windshield. I was a contracts risk director. I destroy liabilities for a living. And the people who had destroyed my life were the biggest liabilities I had ever seen. A quiet, efficient legal victory was no longer an option. I did not just want to stop the land transfer. I did not just want to clear my name in a private courtroom settlement. That was far too merciful. I decided the revenge must happen in the exact arena where these people worshipped most. It had to happen under the bright, unforgiving lights of their high society world. I was going to tear them apart in front of their wealthy donors, their aggressive commercial lenders, the flash of the press cameras, and the polished local elite who still bowed to Lenora as if she was untouchable royalty. They wanted to steal my family in the dark. I was going to execute them in the blinding light of day. I returned to Unit 17 just before 3 o'clock in the morning. The heavy, artificial chill of the storage locker was a stark contrast to the humid coastal night, but I welcomed the freezing air. It matched the absolute zero temperature of my current emotional state. I dropped the extracted tablet data and the scorched manila envelope onto the plastic folding table. My father looked up from his cot, his eyes exhausted and questioning, but I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I was no longer a grieving daughter seeking solace. I was a contracts risk director, and I had a catastrophic liability to dismantle. I opened my laptop and went to work. This was my sanctuary. For 10 years at Northwake Civic Systems, I had dismantled massive corporate structures by finding the tiny, imperceptible structural flaws hidden deep within their paperwork. Now, I turned that exact same forensic skill set against the people who had stolen my life. I began rebuilding their entire fraud network on the blank aluminum walls of the storage unit. I used thick rolls of architectural tape and black markers to connect the fragments. I took the backdated insurance timing my father had compiled and overlaid it with the digital calendar entries I had pulled from Grant's tablet. I traced the signature layers on the forged vendor contracts, comparing the ink degradation and the metadata timestamps. The mechanics of their theft were undeniably brilliant, but they were entirely reliant on momentum. The dates of the probate filings, the emergency board actions, and the medical declarations were stacked so tightly together that they formed a perfect, unnatural vertical line. Real life is messy. Only a meticulously planned conspiracy moves with such frictionless precision. While I was mapping the land record anomalies, Mara walked through the heavy metal door. She was not alone. Walking slightly ahead of her, looking as though he was marching toward his own execution, was a man in a rumpled beige suit. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently at his sides. "Pearl, this is Owen Pike," Mara announced, locking the deadbolt behind them. "He is a mid-level internal accountant for Wallace Dane. He has been laundering the internal payment summaries between the shell companies and the Port Corridor Development Fund." I stepped away from the wall of evidence and looked at the frightened man. He was the weak link in the armor, the kind of mid-tier employee who handled the dirtiest numbers but received none of the actual millions. "Please," Owen choked out, his eyes darting frantically around the illuminated war room. "You have to understand, if Wallace finds out I am here, he will not just fire me. People who cross him on this port project end up vanishing completely." I leaned against the folding table, crossing my arms. Mara told me you want federal tax protection and a guaranteed immunity deal. You want to survive the collapse of Wallace Dane. I can give you exactly that, Owen, but you have to give me the absolute core of the operation. I know about the stolen disaster funds. I know about the forged trust amendments. Tell me something I do not know. Owen swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a single, incredibly old piece of heavy parchment encased in a plastic protective sleeve. He laid it flat on the table. You think Wallace just wants the land because it is valuable, Owen said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper, but he is actually trapped. 2 years ago, Wallace leveraged his entire commercial empire to secure the preliminary financing for the port corridor. He promised the international lenders a perfectly clear, unobstructed path to the deep water inlet. But during the initial survey, we found a catastrophic legal obstacle hidden beneath the Boyd Cemetery parcel. He pointed a shaking finger at the faded ink on the parchment. There is an ancestral easement permanently attached to that specific plot of earth. It was drafted over 100 years ago. It strictly prohibits any heavy commercial excavation or industrial rezoning on those grounds in perpetuity. It is an ironclad deed restriction. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. The structural flaw. If that easement goes public, the land cannot be developed, I stated, the realization washing over me with profound clarity. The entire port corridor deal legally collapses. Exactly, Owen confirmed, wiping sweat from his pale forehead. And if the port deal collapses, the massive international lenders will immediately call in Wallace's other debts. He will be completely bankrupt in 30 days. His political momentum will shatter. The myth that he is an untouchable titan of industry will die overnight. So, Wallace aggressively bribed 3 senior staff members at the county land office to permanently delete the digital records of the easement and bury the physical deed. He needs Lenora to transfer the title to him instantly, so he can pour 10 feet of solid industrial concrete over the cemetery before anyone realizes the restriction even exists. I looked at the ancient piece of paper. This was not just about corporate greed anymore. This was about desperate, animalistic survival. Wallace was standing on a trapdoor with a rope around his neck, and the Boyd estate was the only thing keeping the floorboards closed. It was time to make the trapdoor swing wide open. I did not want to destroy them instantly. I wanted them to feel the distinct, suffocating panic they had tried to inflict on me. I sat back down at my laptop and began compiling highly targeted, heavily redacted packets of data. I did not show my full hand. I took just enough evidence of the insurance inconsistencies and the offshore payment routing numbers to trigger automated risk algorithms. Using an encrypted virtual private network, I leaked the first packet directly to the risk management departments of the 3 primary commercial lenders underwriting Wallace's port project. 10 minutes later, I sent a second, slightly more detailed file to a relentless, notoriously aggressive regional investigative reporter who had spent the last 5 years trying to expose corruption in the county zoning board. We sat in the humming storage unit and watched the pressure slowly rise. By early Sunday morning, the external world began to react. Mara intercepted panicked digital chatter on Wallace's internal servers. The banks were suddenly freezing the preliminary infrastructure credit lines, demanding immediate, unannounced audits. The insurers who underwrote my father's massive life policies flagged the death paperwork, asking why the trust activity and the land movement had accelerated so neatly within hours of the Marina fire. The heat was turning up, and the enemy was starting to burn. The outside pressure forced Lenora and Wallace into a massive, unforced error. They realized they could no longer wait for a quiet, closed-door meeting on Monday morning. They needed to secure the legal title immediately, and they needed to do it under the guise of absolute, unshakable public legitimacy. They needed to look incredibly strong to keep the lenders from pulling out entirely. By noon, the digital invitations went out across the county. They were combining a high society memorial dinner with an emergency redevelopment gala at the County Maritime Hall. They announced they would be executing an emergency probate declaration live at the event, officially transferring the Boyd legacy into the Port Corridor Trust in honor of my father's supposed final wishes. They wanted to finalize the theft, while the press cameras were flashing and the wealthy donors were weeping. They thought the bright lights would protect them from the shadows. "They are rushing," my father noted, staring at the digital invitation glowing on the monitor. "They are terrified." "Frightened rich people are often at their absolute most vicious," I replied, my tone completely flat. "They are going to try to corner me at that gala. Reese will have the forged vendor contracts ready to leak to the press the exact second I try to object to the land transfer. They want my public execution to serve as the entertainment for the evening." I was walking directly into a heavily fortified war zone, and I needed absolute insurance. I opened a new terminal window on my computer and began writing a custom execution script. I tied the command directly to the internal gyroscope and the global positioning system inside my cellular phone. "What are you building?" Mara asked, watching the rapid lines of code scroll across the dark screen. "A dead man's switch," I answered, my fingers flying across the keys. "I am setting up a mirrored release of the entire unredacted archive, the forged contracts, the stolen disaster funds, the bribes to the land office, the ancestral easement, the fake medical records, everything. I am linking the trigger to my physical location. If my phone stops moving for more than 2 hours, or if the biometric sensor registers a forced shutdown, the servers in this room will automatically blast the entire archive to every single bank, press outlet, federal regulator, and major donor on the eastern seaboard." I hit the final command key. The script locked into place, an invisible, devastating bomb waiting for a single misstep. I looked at my father and Mara. The meticulous planning phase was officially over. The trap was fully constructed, the bait was set, and the jaws were primed to snap shut. I closed my laptop and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of my dark clothing. I was ready to go to the gala. I was ready to watch their elegant, untouchable empire burn to the ground. The dead man's switch was armed and waiting for a single misstep, but my professional paranoia completely refused to let me sleep. It was creeping toward 4 o'clock in the morning. The artificial chill of the storage unit felt heavier now, pressing down on my exhausted shoulders. I began meticulously sorting through the oldest banker boxes stacked against the far wall, the ones my father had packed away over 7 years ago. I needed to ensure Reese Tolland had not buried any secondary traps in the foundational paperwork of the estate. At the bottom of a water-damaged cardboard box, beneath a stack of preliminary structural blueprints for the waterfront, I found a single yellowed file folder. It felt different from the crisp, freshly printed forgeries we had been analyzing all night. Inside was a vendor authorization waiver dated exactly 9 years ago. It was from the very first wave of the coastal disaster recovery payouts. My eyes locked onto the bottom of the page. My name was typed clearly on the primary guarantor line, accompanied by a crude but legally binding proxy signature stamp. I stared at the faded blue ink. This was not one of Reese Tolland's recent digital manipulations. This was an original, physical document. A cold, intensely nauseating realization washed over my entire body. Reese had not simply chosen me as a scapegoat out of thin air. He had a legal precedent. This single, aging sheet of paper was the foundational architecture that allowed Lenora and the family lawyer to build an entire, inescapable frame job around me, because my name was already resting quietly on the earliest fraudulent accounts. They could easily manipulate the narrative to make it look like I had been managing the illicit vendor networks from the very beginning. I stood up, holding the fragile yellowed paper in my tightly clenched fist, and walked over to my father's canvas cot. He was awake, staring blankly at the aluminum ceiling, the weight of his staged death visibly pressing him into the thin mattress. "Did you sign this?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm, completely stripped of any human inflection. I held the waiver inches from his face. Wesley sat up slowly, his exhausted eyes focusing on the document. The remaining color drained completely from his weathered cheeks. He did not try to look away, and he did not try to deny it. It was the first month of the massive storms, he whispered, staring at his trembling hands. Wallace needed the cash released instantly to secure the heavy construction machinery from out of state. The central bank required a secondary corporate officer to sign the high-risk indemnity waiver. You were just starting your career at Northwake Civic Systems. Your title carried an immense amount of unblemished corporate credibility. I used your proxy stamp. I felt the ground completely fall out from under me. You used my name to authorize stolen government funds. I chose speed over honesty, he pleaded, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic urgency. I wanted to maintain the flawless image of the unstoppable Boyd Holding Company, and I wanted to keep our family stability entirely intact. I told myself it was just a temporary bridge loan to save lives. I swore to myself I would quietly scrub your name from the ledger before you ever felt the legal consequences. The carefully maintained ice in my veins instantly turned into boiling acid. I did not yell like a deeply grieving daughter mourning a fractured family. I erupted like a woman who had just discovered her own father had deliberately strapped a bomb to her chest while she was sleeping. You mortgaged my freedom, I shouted, the raw sound echoing violently off the corrugated metal walls. You sat at that table earlier tonight and acted like you were just a passive, tragic victim of Wallace and Lenora. You let me believe they pulled my name out of the dark simply to get rid of me, but you handed them the weapon. You gave them the legal precedent to put me in a federal prison. How dare you ask me for trust when you are the exact man who built my gallows? Pearl, please, he begged, reaching a hand out toward me. I was going to fix it. I was trying to protect the Empire for you. Do not touch me, I snarled, stepping backward as if his physical proximity might contaminate me. My entire professional life is built on anticipating risk, and the absolute greatest liability in my life was sitting at the head of my own dinner table. I threw the yellowed waiver violently onto his cot. I turned my back on him and walked to the far corner of the storage locker. For one long, agonizing night, I stood completely still, staring at the locked metal door. My thumb lingered tensely over the command script running on my phone screen. For a moment, I seriously considered shutting the whole thing down right there in the dark. I could trigger the dead man's switch, expose the entire unredacted archive to the federal authorities, and walk out into the humid coastal morning. I would let Wallace, Lenora, Reese, and my own father drown equally in the horrific truth he had delayed for nearly a decade. From a strictly legal standpoint, they all absolutely deserved a jail cell. Mara Quill walked over and stood beside me. The retired postal inspector did not offer a comforting pat on the shoulder. Her eyes were hard, objective, and entirely devoid of pity. She refused to soothe either of us. You can walk away right now, Pearl, Mara stated, her voice as hard and unyielding as granite. You can press that button and let the federal agents sort out the wreckage. I have seen massive fraud rings collapse before, and it is always the family ties that rot first. But revenge without absolute moral clarity collapses the exact second your emotion changes. If you burn him down tonight simply because you are angry he used you, you are no better than Lenora reacting to a threat. If you want to survive this complete nightmare with your own soul intact, you have to decide what justice actually looks like in the harsh light of day. I let the heavy silence stretch for over an hour. The fluorescent shop lights buzzed relentlessly overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across the concrete floor. My anger did not fade, but it slowly compressed, turning from a wild, destructive fire into a highly directed, surgical laser. Finally, I turned around and walked back to the center folding table. Wesley looked up, his shoulders slumped, bracing himself for the final, fatal blow he knew he deserved. I will help you survive this morning, I told him, my tone stripped of every single ounce of familial affection. I will help you take back the land from Lenora, and I will help you destroy Wallace Dane. But I am making a hard new rule right now. I am not covering up your massive sins just to punish theirs. I will not carry your liability anymore. My father nodded slowly, silently waiting for the terms of his surrender. When the moment comes, I dictated, my eyes locked dead onto his. when we are standing in the maritime hall, when the cameras are flashing and the police walk through the doors, you will not play the role of the heroic survivor. You will stand up and confess publicly to your own role in the fraud. You will look at the press, and you will admit to the initial theft, the shortcuts, and you will admit to using your own daughter's name on a forged document. You will burn your own legacy to the ground. Wesley swallowed hard. He looked down at the yellowed waiver resting on his blanket, then up at my uncompromising face. He realized I was not negotiating. I was offering a contract with a zero-tolerance penalty clause. "I will do it," he promised, his voice heavy with the absolute certainty of his own ruin. "I will tell them everything." Our alliance survived the brutal night, but the fundamental nature of it had permanently shifted. It was no longer built on sentiment, shared grief, or the desperate, naive hope of repairing a shattered family dynamic. It was built entirely on truth, severe leverage, and the cold, shared knowledge that absolutely nobody gets to hide anymore. We were going to the memorial gala, and we were going to tear the roof down on all of our heads. The night air hung over the Carolina coast like a wet, suffocating blanket. Mara had insisted on moving my father from Unit 17 to a decaying, cash-only motel on the absolute edge of the county line for the final 24 hours leading up to the public gala. It was supposed to be a total blind spot. It was supposed to be a secure holding cell where the enemy could not track him. But at 2 o'clock in the morning, the violent vibration of my cellular phone shattered the fragile silence inside the storage unit. I picked up the device from the plastic folding table. The incoming text message was from a blocked, untraceable number. The words glowing on the glass screen made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. "We have the ghost. Bring the full digital drive from the storage unit to the waterfront office by dawn. Come entirely alone. If you alert the authorities, your father will not survive a second tragic accident." The cold, surgical control I had meticulously built all week threatened to shatter into a million pieces. The enemy had found him, while I was busy building a digital snare. Wallace Dane's private security contractors had kicked the door in. Mara walked through the heavy metal door of the locker a moment later, her face set like carved stone, her gray cardigan soaked from the sudden downpour outside. "The motel room is completely empty," she reported, her voice devoid of its usual calm authority. "The door frame is splintered. There are distinct signs of a violent, brief struggle. They took him. Pearl." My immediate instinct was purely reckless. The risk director vanished, replaced entirely by a desperate daughter. I grabbed my car keys from the table, fully prepared to drive straight into Wallace's hostile territory and trade every single piece of encrypted evidence for my father's life. Before my hand could even reach the metal handle of the rolling door, a massive, imposing shadow detached itself from the row of dying pine trees outside the facility. It was Amos Bell. The gravedigger stood in the pouring rain, his heavy work boots coated in fresh, thick mud, and his broad chest heaving with exertion. "Do not get in that car, madam," Amos warned, his gravelly voice cutting sharply through the relentless sound of the coastal storm. "If you drive to those docks right now, neither of you will ever walk out." "They have him, Amos," I snapped, my voice shaking with raw panic. "They have my father, and they want the drive." Amos stepped inside the harsh, artificial light of the unit and firmly pushed the door shut behind him. "Your father planned for exactly this possibility. He knew the moment he applied real pressure, Wallace would hunt him down. He knew this storage locker was just a decoy, a working room meant to draw their attention. The actual leverage, the final kill shot that secures the estate, was never stored on a hard drive in a roadside shed. I stared at the man. "Where is it?" "Get your coat," Amos commanded. "We have to go back to the grave." We drove through the pitch-black night, my windshield wipers fighting a completely losing battle against the torrential rain. The historic coastal cemetery was a terrifying landscape of jagged shadows, sinking tombstones, and rising water. We walked directly through the flooded grass to the fresh, dark mound of earth where I had stood just days ago. Amos did not hesitate for a single second. He plunged his heavy iron shovel violently into the softened dirt. The physical labor took nearly 45 minutes of agonizing silence. Every scrape of metal against stone sounded like a gunshot in the deserted graveyard. I dug with my bare hands, tearing my fingernails on sharp rocks, driven by pure, blinding adrenaline. Finally, the iron shovel struck the polished mahogany lid of the massive decoy coffin. Amos cleared the thick mud from the edges, reached deep down into the dark hole, and ran his thick, calloused fingers along the bottom edge of the wooden box. He found exactly what he was looking for. He pressed a hidden mechanical latch. A false base at the bottom of the casket slid open with a sharp, echoing click. Amos reached into the hidden compartment and pulled out a sealed, heavy-duty waterproof pouch. He handed it up to me. My hands were freezing, entirely numb from the driving rain, but I managed to rip the thick plastic seal open. Inside were 3 distinct items. The first was the original, physical land deed to the cemetery parcel, complete with the ancestral easement permanently blocking any commercial development. The second was a highly detailed, unsigned trust revocation, a legal document my father had secretly drafted to permanently strip Lenora of all executive power, though he never got the chance to officially file it. The third item was a small, black digital voice recorder. I wiped the rain from my eyes and pressed the play button. The audio was slightly grainy, clearly captured from a hidden device planted deep inside the Boyd Lake house, but the voices were unmistakably clear. Wallace Dane spoke first, asking about the specific timing of the estate transfer. Then came Lenora's voice, laced with an absolute, chilling malice that made my stomach aggressively turn. The blast at the marina needs to be loud enough to bury him socially. Wallace, my stepmother said through the small speaker, there can be no open casket. There can be no forensic questions. We need the estate to transfer before the smoke even clears. I stood over the open, empty grave, gripping the plastic recorder tight enough to crack the casing. Lenora had not just been complicit in a corporate takeover. She had actively ordered the violent execution of her own husband. We raced back to Unit 17. Mara was waiting at the computer terminal. She had already run a sophisticated trace on the burner phone that sent the ransom text. The signal bounced off a private cellular tower directly above Wallace Dane's waterfront office, Mara confirmed, pointing to a glowing red dot pulsating on her monitor. I can call my former federal contacts right now. Pearl? We can authorize a quiet tactical raid. We can send an armed team in and pull your father out of that office before dawn. I stared at the red dot on the screen, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The urge to save him instantly was overwhelming, but then the cold, calculating logic of a risk director took over. If we execute a quiet rescue right now, we completely lose the war, I stated, the realization dropping like a heavy stone in the room. Wallace has a literal army of high-priced defense lawyers on retainer. If the police raid that office, Wallace will immediately bury the financial evidence. He will claim my father faked his own death as a publicity stunt to frame his innocent business partners. The stolen disaster funds will be swept completely under the rug, and Lenora will still use the forged trust amendment to push the land transfer through civil court. The corruption will absolutely survive, and they will simply try to kill him again next year. I looked at the ransom message on my phone. I finally understood the terrifying geometry of the trap. The enemy wanted 2 very specific things at once. They wanted my legal signature to surrender the estate, and they desperately wanted my panic. They wanted me to rush into their territory, terrified and irrational, making a fatal mistake that would allow them to eliminate the final obstacle in the dark. Either my signature or my panic would destroy the last, desperate chance we had to crush them permanently. I chose the significantly harder, far more agonizing path. We do not call the authorities yet, I told Mara, my voice dropping to a resolute, dead calm. I am going to walk directly into that morning event entirely alone, exactly as they requested. I will let them think I am completely cornered and broken. We are going to force the horrific truth out into the glaring daylight, right in front of the press, the lenders, and the donors, where their massive wealth cannot quietly bury it. The hours leading up to the dawn were an exercise in absolute discipline. I stripped off my damp, mud-stained clothes and dressed in the exact same pristine black funeral attire I had worn to the initial burial. It was no longer a symbol of tragic mourning. It was my battle armor. I took a blank flash drive from the table and deliberately loaded it with layers of encrypted junk files, creating the perfect, irresistible decoy. I could not risk Reese Tolland demanding his private security guard search my purse at the door of the Maritime Hall. I took a sharp pair of scissors from the supply box and carefully sliced open the heavy black silk lining of my tailored winter coat. I slipped the original land deed, the unsigned trust revocation, and the digital voice recorder deep inside the interior fabric. Using strong adhesive strips and a dark fabric patch from a small travel kit, I carefully sealed the seam completely. The undeniable truth was now secured against my own body. As the very first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the corrugated metal door, I stepped out of the storage locker. The fierce storm had finally broken, leaving the coastal air sharp, clean, and bitterly cold. I gripped the decoy drive tightly in my right hand, feeling the heavy, comforting weight of the real evidence resting securely against my ribs. I walked slowly toward my car, entirely ready to face the monsters in the morning light. The County Maritime Hall was a massive, vaulted structure of glass and steel overlooking the gray Atlantic Ocean. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the main ballroom was entirely packed with the absolute elite of the coastal society. News cameras were strategically positioned in the back. Lenders in expensive bespoke suits mingled with local politicians. The Memorial Redevelopment Gala was designed to be a completely impenetrable fortress of public relations. Lenora stood on the raised platform at the front of the room, draped in flawlessly tailored mourning black. She performed the role of the devastated, brave widow to absolute perfection, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Beside her, Wallace Dane practically vibrated with aggressive, victorious energy. He stood behind a clear acrylic podium, gesturing toward glossy architectural renderings of the new port corridor, selling the illusion of inevitable, unstoppable progress. And hovering just behind them both was Reese Tolland, clutching the thick leather folio that contained the emergency probate packet. It was the legal guillotine designed to strip me of all executive control in front of a live, heavily broadcasted audience. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom. I let my shoulders sag. I kept my eyes focused on the floor, projecting the image of a thoroughly broken, exhausted daughter who simply had no fight left. Whispers rippled through the wealthy crowd as they parted to let me pass. They saw a victim walking to the slaughter. "Pearl, my dear," Reese said smoothly into his lapel microphone, his voice echoing through the massive hall. "We know this is an incredibly difficult morning, but your father wanted this transition to be seamless. If you could just join us up here to finalize the temporary administration, we can secure his legacy and let his soul rest in peace." I stepped up onto the stage. I looked at Lenora, who offered me a sickly, triumphant smile. I looked at Wallace, who was already reaching for a gold-plated pen. Then, I stepped directly up to the main microphone. "I have one question before I sign anything," I said. My voice did not shake. It rang out through the heavy speakers, cold and sharp as cracked ice. "Why are you all in such a desperate, panicked rush to sell land that legally cannot transfer until the right man is actually buried beneath it?" A heavy, confused silence fell over the ballroom. The polite smiles froze. "Pearl, your grief is clouding your judgment," Lenora whispered sharply, stepping closer and reaching lightly for my sleeve. I pulled away at once. Before Reese could signal the sound engineers to cut my microphone, the heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung violently open. Amos Bell walked straight down the center aisle. He was no longer covered in mud. The gravedigger wore a clean, pressed suit, but his presence in the room of billionaires felt like a massive, undeniable weight. "The coffin we lowered into the ground on Thursday afternoon did not hold Wesley Boyd," Amos stated loudly, his booming voice carrying easily without the aid of a microphone. It held exactly 200 pounds of industrial lead weight bags. I know, because I packed them myself. The entire room erupted into a chaotic murmur. Flashbulbs from the press cameras began to fire rapidly, illuminating the sudden, absolute terror flashing across Wallace Dane's face. "This man is clearly unstable," Reese barked into the microphone, his polished lawyer facade cracking instantly. "Security, remove him immediately. Miss Boyd is suffering a public breakdown." "I am not breaking down, Reese. I am simply reading the receipts," I countered, pulling a thick stack of folded papers from the deep pockets of my coat. I threw them onto the podium so hard they scattered across the acrylic surface. "Here are the burial logs. Here are the funeral invoices. Here are the cemetery access records, proving the heavy machinery was ordered 4 days before the boat exploded." I reached inside the torn silk lining of my black coat and pulled out the digital voice recorder I had retrieved from the grave. I held it directly up to the microphone and pressed play. Lenora's voice filled the massive hall, amplified to a deafening volume. "The blast at the marina needs to be loud enough to bury him socially. Wallace. There can be no open casket. There can be no forensic questions. We need the estate to transfer before the smoke even clears." The collective gasp from the donors and politicians sounded like all the oxygen being instantly sucked out of the room. Lenora staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth, the flawless widow mask shattering into a million jagged pieces right in front of the regional press. Down in the front row, Grant Boyd completely broke. The weak, debt-ridden runner could not handle the blinding light of exposure. He fell to his knees, throwing his hands over his head. "I did not want to kill him," Grant screamed, sobbing hysterically in front of the horrified crowd. "Wallace made me do it. He owned my gambling debts. I falsified the medical deliveries. I moved the cash envelopes for the fake vendors. I planted the documents in Pearl's townhouse to make her look guilty. I am so sorry. Pearl. They made me do it." Wallace Dane lunged forward, a cornered, vicious animal attempting to regain control of his collapsing empire. He grabbed the podium, his face purple with rage, completely abandoning his sophisticated charm. "Shut the cameras off. This is a coordinated corporate smear campaign. It is a federal execution of a search warrant," a calm, authoritative voice announced from the side entrance. Mara Quill walked into the ballroom, flanked by 12 armed agents from the Financial Crimes Division. They fanned out across the room, completely blocking all the exits. The timed evidence release I had set up earlier that morning had done its job flawlessly. When my dead man's switch hit the servers, it triggered massive lender fraud alerts and exposed the insurance inconsistencies directly to the federal authorities. "Wallace Dane," Mara stated clearly, holding up a thick stack of legal documents. "We have sworn statements from your internal accountant, Owen Pike. We have irrefutable proof of your massive land easement concealment and your theft of federal disaster recovery funds. You're done." The federal agents moved in, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto Wallace's wrists right in front of the flashing cameras. In the middle of the chaotic, beautiful collapse, the back doors opened one final time. The crowd parted in absolute, stunned silence. Walking down the aisle, looking exhausted but undeniably alive, was my father. Wesley Boyd had been recovered mere minutes earlier. When my mirrored evidence release hit the banks at dawn, the massive panic forced Wallace's private security men to scatter and abandon the waterfront office to protect themselves from federal indictment, leaving my father locked inside but completely unharmed. Lenora let out a horrifying, guttural scream at the sight of her living husband. She collapsed onto the stage, knowing her entire life was completely over. Wesley walked up the stairs, standing beside me at the podium. He looked at the ruined faces of his enemies, then turned to the crowd, preparing to accept their shock and sympathy. But I did not let the moment turn soft. I did not let him play the role of the innocent, resurrected martyr. I promised him I would not protect his legacy, and I always honor my contracts. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a second flash drive, and plugged it directly into the audio-visual system hooked into the main presentation screens. Massive, undeniable images of the forged vendor waivers bearing my name filled the wall behind us, and then my father's own audio confession, recorded in the freezing storage locker, echoed across the silent room. The crowd listened as Wesley admitted to choosing speed over honesty, admitted to using my name to authorize stolen government funds, and admitted to building the exact legal architecture that allowed his wife to run a massive fraud engine. I looked at my father. He closed his eyes and bowed his head, accepting the absolute destruction of his own name exactly as he had promised. I proved right then and there that I was not merely saving one guilty parent by sacrificing the truth. I was burning the entire disease system to the ground. By noon, the empire was completely eradicated. Lenora was stripped of the estate and taken into federal custody for conspiracy to commit murder. Wallace permanently lost his port corridor, his massive commercial lending lines, and his freedom. Reese Tolland was arrested for widespread document forgery and fraud. Grant accepted a pathetic plea deal to testify against them all. The elegant, untouchable society mask they had spent years protecting shattered violently in the exact venue they thought they controlled the most. In the long, quiet aftermath of the scandal, I took back the Boyd family land. I legally fortified the ancestral easement, ensuring Wallace Dane's concrete would never touch it. I restored the historic cemetery, planting fresh grass over the false grave. Using the remnants of the liquidated estate, I funded a massive, heavily audited storm survivor housing trust entirely in Nora Boyd's name, putting the stolen millions back into the hands of the desperate families who actually deserved them. My father went to a minimum security federal facility, paying the price for his delayed truth. I visit him once a month, not out of deep familial love, but out of a rigid, shared respect for the survivors we became. The story closes with a hard-earned, quiet final image. I stood alone on the edge of the coastal cemetery, feeling the cool ocean breeze wash over my face. They tried to bury me in the dark alongside my father. Instead, I stood tall above the empty grave, completely free, and watched their entire corrupt empire go down first. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know exactly where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Like this video, and support me by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by many more people around the world.